Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar entitled Strengthen Your Workforce by Using Benchmarks and Industry Analytics Data. Please allow me to introduce our presenter for the day, Andrew Davis. He's our VP of Product Management. Andrew was raised in the Midwest and first arrived in Dallas through a Kodak corporate relocation back in 2001. And he started his career working in digital image management in healthcare. He spent 14 years in medical data management, where the highlight there was working with the team that launched the first broad-scale medical data inference engine. This technology was so far ahead of its time that IBM pays royalties for use in the Watson product line. He left healthcare in 2014 to pursue his dream of building a startup, and he did. Andrew's companies were accepted in both the Collide Village Accelerator here in Dallas and the Capital Factory Accelerator in Austin. After successfully graduating, raising funds, and launching both companies, he began working with other companies looking to implement lean growth strategies. Andrew is excited to be a part of the TrenData team. He hasn't been here too long, but he is certainly an expert in this domain of knowledge, and we are proud to introduce Andrew Davis.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today. Let's just get started as we talk about strengthening your workforce by using benchmarks and industry analytics data. Quick agenda this morning. I'm going to give you a couple slide overview of the company, TrenData, and we're going to jump right into a four-step blueprint for how to start applying benchmark and industry data against your data set within your organization. We'll jump into leveraging technology to assist how you can capitalize and monetize this data. And we'll go into a brief demonstration, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A session. So a little bit about TrenData here. Our primary focus is on AI-driven people analytics. We operate in the cloud, so we can rapidly deploy our instances. We are headquartered in Richardson, Texas, which is right outside of Dallas. And we launched our company in October 2017. Here are just a few of our clients that leverage our solution today. And we focus on three key deliverables. We like to be quick, simple, and insightful. So mentioned earlier about being a cloud service provider. We can have our instances up and running within a day. We'll get into some data loading here later on, and we can have actually insightful metrics within that same day. From a UX perspective, we try to get you to the data as quick as possible. We focus on 2 clicks to this actionable data, and then insightful. So there are a lot of platforms to choose from. We know you have choice. We want to make it as simple and easy for you to get up and running and to dive into your own data. We all hate waiting for IT to answer our tickets to get us the metrics that we need. So we take that to heart and we make it so through natural language processing and other avenues, you can dig right into the data without needing additional support. So one of the keys here in industry today is really around knowledge. Knowledge is power. There's no two ways about it. We've got the famous quote from Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, the most valuable commodity I know of is information. If you're making decisions one way or another, you need to know where you are. You need to know about your surroundings, and that's going to help you. We all have constraints of which we try to operate in, and that's going to help you understand what's inside of your control and what's outside of your control, and where your best avenues are for improvement. So what is benchmarking? At a core, simple definition of benchmarking is comparing your business process and performance to industry best practices from your neighboring companies. So you look at this both in industry and competitors. So you want to look not only of if you're in technology at other tech companies, but also who may value your employee base. That might be right across the street. They might not be in a tech company, but they may have a customer service or account management division. And your people it's hard to say sometimes, may be interested in a move, and you need to understand what they're paying in regards to what you're paying. It's typically measured by quality, time, and cost. So the value of your performance, how that trends over time, and what the end result is to the business. So let's talk about a quick blueprint. We've broken this down into a 4-step process. So we're going to start with deciding what to benchmark. So it's key that you get business buy-in. First step we always recommend. There's lots of things out there that you can benchmark. There's lots of things that are recommended by industry groups, but you need to make sure you're keeping your eye on what's an important focus for the business. If it's productivity, then it's key to look at productivity metrics. If it's cost, then it's key to look at financial metrics. Once you understand and you get everybody aligned over the core aspects that you want to measure, then you want to start looking at where you go about getting your internal information. So we want to measure this productivity today. What systems do we have in play that are actively capturing productivity, and how can we start pulling and leveraging that data? From there, we want to look at opportunities. So you get the initial data out, and you may be able to put it on a simple graph or a bar chart, and it's going to give you a trend. And some of these key pieces are you're going to want to look for gaps. When you find these gaps, it's important to develop a target. This is going to tell you that, first and foremost, like most improvement plans, is you have to admit that there's a problem. And once you know that there's a problem, you can start focusing on areas around that problem of which you need to improve. From here, the next step is to move into, I now understand a little bit how I am doing. Now I need to understand how the market is doing. Where can I go to find sources of benchmarking information? So back internally, it's important to understand your own memberships and subscriptions. Where can you go that you've already bought the data or have access to the data? So identify those providers. And a couple slides here, we'll talk about other providers available in the industry. And to really focus on, we want to try to get an apples to apples style comparison. So we need to look at our industry. So if we're manufacturing, we need to keep that in mind, that we wouldn't want to necessarily compare ourselves against high-tech firms. It's a different base, it's a different market, as well as position. If we are focused on statewide services, we wouldn't necessarily want to compare ourselves nationally. If we're a national company, we wouldn't necessarily want to compare ourselves globally. So you really need to make sure you stay focused and you keep these apples to apples. We've got internal and external averages, so we need to look internally. I always like to say, check, at least get a high-level feel of how the industry is benchmarking so that internally we can benchmark in a similar fashion. If we're looking at specific salary grades, but we see the industry is using a broader turn of bands, we may want to look at how we can translate our internal metrics so that it's more in line with what we're going to see industry as a whole, so that we true up. We know, if we're talking about compensation, we know we're paying employees relatively what the industry would be paying someone in their position. And then collecting all of this and comparing it. So you've identified what you want, you've identified how you want to do it. Now the important part is to get the most accurate and current information as possible. If you're going to do a 5-year trend, try to go back for all 5 years. Most importantly is how we're doing so far to date. So we're coming up on midway through 2019. If we were only to use 2018 and prior metrics, we're leaving the most recent 6-month pool of data out of the window. And there may be some valuable insight there to tell us how we've done the first part of this year. So the best of our ability. Sometimes they can be tricky, but you want to try to isolate and establish where you can get as much of that information as possible. So with that, good places to start digging in and looking. We always say from HR information management that SHRM is a great place to start. Not only is it a great community, but they have good insight as well. They publish a lot of reports and core level benchmarking information. From there, we break it down into a couple of specific areas to focus on. From a compensation perspective, Salary.com and Culpeper are good sources. We can bring in comparably. As we move up, we get more service providing offerings. Willis Towers Watson and Mercer, not only do they have data, but they also have good consulting efforts as well if you might need a little assistance in terms of how you want to shape up your compensation metrics, your benchmarking, especially if you're looking going forward in strategies and you might want some assistance around how to set up these improvement programs or to bring your company in line over time. On the recruiting side, we've got ERE. They are to recruiting what SHRM is to HR. And we also see Workable and Hire Rights. They offer benchmarking data as well from a recruiting perspective. On the workforce management side, we get a little bit into turnover. We've got Compensation Force. We kind of list them on the workforce side while they do have compensation data. They have additional insight that really focuses on turnover and reasons for turnovers. CEB from a global benchmarking perspective. CIPD is kind of the SHRM of the UK. It's not only good for global, but they have US benchmarking data as well, so you can kind of dive in granularly. And then last but not least, Bloomberg. They have an annual report that they publish. So looking at historical years, you're able to go back and get that report and look at how the industry is performing. At this point, you could get their 2018 report. Back to the blueprint, our next step 3, we want to look at, we've identified our targets, we've identified sources of information. How do we start bringing all this together and using this information effectively? So we want to look at common findings. What do we see as gaps internally that we can also identify as gaps and opportunities in the benchmarking data? Now, there is a plethora of insights available out there. So one of the key things that we always stress is keep it business related. You see all sorts of hip and trendy things like bring your dog to work policies, and you need to understand, is that really, it may sound cool, it may be hip, it may give you some PR opportunities, but we want to keep things grounded from the perspective of the business. Is this really tying back to tangible outcomes and performance data for how you want to see yourself and benchmark compared to the industry? And then we come back to these gaps. So we've identified some internal gaps, and now we see the benchmarking data. The next step is, are there gaps from what we're collecting and where we go about measuring it within the industry? So this would be, maybe we have attendance data for our company, but we don't really see attendance data in our specific geography, or that may or may not be available to us. So it's important to call these out up front, just as an assumption, to say, we know where we are from an attendance. We don't really know where our specific geography is for our industry, for attendance data. So at this point, we'd be setting an internal benchmark, something we want to strive for, but we really don't have the ability to compare from an outside-in perspective. This helps us establish grounds for needs for improvement. So I know what my employee base is. I know what my performance. I know productivity. Let's start looking at ways we can improve. So we want to keep this two-sided. So you always want to look at kind of the give and take approach of what is the business looking to gain from our staff, But as you look at problems within, or opportunities rather, within the employee community, where do we have the ability to give back as well? And this is important in benchmarking things like turnover with where our staff is going. Where are we acquiring them from? Where are we sending them to? As you break down your populations, high performers is a costly population to turn over. And if you're starting to see trends where that is turning over, we need to focus on the opportunity for the improvement. And alluding to competition, it's not only within your industry, but also your specific geography. You need to keep the eye out for the bigger, better deal. It is a tight labor market in most geographies today. And you need to know that employees have choices, as well as the headhunters and the recruiters out there are hungry. And so most employees have emails, every week in their inbox about a bigger opportunity or better opportunity, and it may just be right down the street. So it's not always the industry focus that impacts your staff. It might be radius to home. You're an hour commute for them, and they might have an opportunity in a different industry that's only 20 minutes away. And that's something that is helping them make up their decisions around work-life balance. So moving on to step 4, we've got all these other pieces and a general understanding of what to do. How do we bring it back to overall value to the company and the strategy? So we need to, balance and mitigate what it's going to take to implement all of these steps, keeping them in line with the strategy, and understanding the time commitment for the curve. Not everything can be implemented overnight. A lot of things in terms of employee development and continuing education plans may take a year, 18 months to bring up to speed. So you want to make sure you've got a balance of short-term improvement that you can demonstrate and long-term goals to trend against in terms of progress. So this is key in terms of feedback to the executive leadership. Everybody gets to this, what have you done for me lately? We've got quarterly goals and targets. So to make sure that we satisfy the needs of the business there of showing continuing improvement. And then as you do that, evolving your benchmarks over time. Every time we compare benchmarks, remember that it is a moment in time. And what we do 6 months from now, there are lots of environmental factors, some within our control, most outside of our control. So it's important to continuously true up of, we may see a spike in employee satisfaction or employee performance. We need to understand what are some of the key triggers internally. Did we go through an acquisition? Did we acquire a company? Was there any kind of a market downturn, or maybe a disaster, a hurricane or an earthquake that came in? All of these are going to impact your metrics. So it's key to understand the events that surround certain triggers or trends that emerge in your data. So going beyond the blueprint into now, how do we make this actionable and insightful? So how can technology help? We've all had this problem of we collect rows and rows of tabular data, and now we have to try to sniff this out. And even when we go to something like a pivot table in Excel, for those of us that know the data very well, we can drive understanding and meaning from it. But when we go to presentations, board meetings, executive leadership roundtables, it can be really hard to drive the impact of exactly what that data is. And that's where, virtually everywhere you turn on the internet today, everyone is talking about visualizing the problem. How do we take this data and bring it into graphs and charts so you can just see? It's real simple when you look at something like a donut chart and turnover, and you've broken it down by what's voluntary versus involuntary. And immediately see this is what we're consciously letting go from the organization. But look at this other chunk that is happening outside of our control, the voluntary quits. and whether or not that's acceptable and how you can slice it and dice it from there. Getting in to drill down and understand. So of those that are voluntarily leaving, what percentage of them are high performers? What percentage of them are low performers? Getting back to why should I care about the data? Is this something I want to stop, or is this something I'm just monitoring and is within acceptable limits? Coming back to those events and trends, we've done an acquisition. Maybe we have excessive staff. We're hoping for some of that churn to bring our numbers in line. So really model that scenario and monitor to make sure that the expected outcome and what we've theorized and modeled is actually what's happening. So, maybe we did an acquisition and we were hoping our sales force would kind of lean itself out, which is happening. But in that scenario, we definitely want to keep our high performers. And if our high performer, we're seeing increased turnover, then we need to rethink that scenario and what can we do to incentivize staff to stay within the organization. So here at TrenData, we look at this, kind of tying it into the blueprint and bringing everything forward, and making it visual and actual. We break it down into kind of three phases. And the first one is intelligent data gathering. So the biggest mountain out there is, where do I go get the information? Because depending on the size of your organization, it can be not a lot of information, but in disparate systems. Sometimes maybe it's information sitting in a spreadsheet. And then in larger organizations, I've got information all over the place. And how do I start bringing this together? So we have intelligent data gathering component. It's kind of the onboard of how to slice and dice your data. First, we have to get it. The nice thing about this solution is we've got multiple connectors that we can bring in. We can pull and aggregate your data from various sources, even flat files. So we always get the question of, I'm a smaller organization, or we just haven't done that good of a job in centralizing our data. So sometimes it may be sitting on somebody's hard drive. We can certainly take that information and bring it in as well, and correlate it with all the other information we have access to, as well as built-in connectors to industry benchmark and specific survey data. So you might be using SurveyMonkey to collect employee satisfaction or exit surveys, or even onboarding surveys. And you really want to understand how your metrics relate to your survey data and possibly tie back to your performance data. We can bring all that together and aggregate it to make it easily accessible for you. How we go about doing that is we've got some pre-built core metrics that we've set up pretty much across the industry, the core things people want to know: my performance, my diversity, not only productivity performance, but financial performance, who's coming in, who's leaving, and how happy are they with the company. And from there, we can go into the natural language side of how you ask questions. And I'll show you this in the demonstration here in a few moments. But kind of back to the analyst of, do I need to have somebody configure a report for me, or can I simply ask the system a question, why not give bigger raises? And does the system understand, in this instance, that what I'm really looking at doing is benchmarking? If I'm asking where I'm doing, then show me from an industry perspective how I rank. And having the ability for the system to understand that and then quickly return the information you're looking for. Going one step beyond, really turning it into actionable insights, is the predictive modeling component. So now that I understand where I am, how I've trended over time, but assuming I want to change the trajectory that I'm on, what are my options? And how can I model certain differences in performance or company programs and understand how that's going to impact a given population over time? Because one of the key areas we come in of kind of the next step forward of showing you where you're most likely to be in the future, not only based on where you are today, but factoring in assumptions. So if you say I'm going to increase my compensation, or I'm going to increase professional development, how is that going to impact a specific employee population? And then bringing in the machine learning aspect of this. So we're constantly bringing in data. We're constantly looking at assumptions that we've made in the past and truing those up over time, and then making corrections to become smarter, accurate, and more responsive. So this just is a continuous process in the background, which then says, here are the statistical values of why the system is making certain predictions going forward, but then it's going to true up. And as those days approach, so I've looked months out, how am I trending to that? And then this is where it really customizes it from a general application to your specific company climate. How does it relate to you, and how are you trending with the built-in models, so that it can really become smarter and more granularly focused on your specific organization over time. And all of this gets to the dream that we all talk about in terms of prescriptive analytics. So really moving into where you can model how do these changes that I'm playing with impact a given population or impact company performance, to is the system recommending and being able to tell me what it thinks is best over time. And we'll talk about some of those pieces as well, that our system can come in and say, okay, it's been great that you've implemented a work from home policy. We think you should continue to invest in that program, and here are the returns on that program you're going to see for the company. With that, let me jump into a quick demo so I can show you a little bit on how the system functions. So this is our dashboard. When you log into the system, you're immediately presented with key metrics. We try to bring things forward to the user as quickly as possible, present them in meaningful ways. Time to fill. For instance, this example, we're running 37.5 days on average. That's a global setting, and we can drill in. Before I drill into specific metrics, I want to talk a little bit about data sources and plugins that we have. So as mentioned earlier on intelligent data gathering, the idea here is how do we go and get as much of your information for you as possible. So we've got built-into connectors to most mainline systems. We can easily set up connectors should you have a system that we don't have, but this is just a sample. We have more connectors than we have on our screen here, as well as industry benchmarking information. So we've got Bureau of Labor Statistics, salary.com, and survey. We have an internal survey tool. We can also connect to industry survey tools like SurveyMonkey, and it's a simple web-based API that you can set up on both ends. Where you don't have API access to your data, we also have a tough universal file format that you can bring in. This is a simple CSV delimited file. You can see this is the data dictionary right here. If you want to set up your columns, the mandatory fields are in red, optional fields are in black, so you can simply turn on and turn off those fields and map your data, and then you can upload this data right into the system. It uploads and processes usually in a matter of minutes, and then the information is immediately available back on your dashboard to analyze and drill into. So for example, on where we want to go, let's look at turnover scenario. We've talked a little bit about it, and now I want to understand something. So I can look into, I've gone into my analytics, so this is just straight line reporting, and it's going to show me my turnover over time. So I can see that it's increasing. It's actually defaulting by giving me a count, and I can jump in here and I can switch this to percentage. So it'll show me that my turnover is currently running just shy of 5%. And it looks, not necessarily in a good position for 2019. We are coming up on summer. Depending on my base, I might have students that are looking at going home for the summer or whatnot. But let's look at this over time to really help us. 6 months doesn't tell us a lot. So now when I look at this over time, I can see that I'm currently trending 17% turnover for the year, which is far better than what I had in 2017. but still higher than 2015 and 16. So we, reaching back to the presentation and understanding your data and the scenario of which things are happening, we have an events overlay that we'll put right on top of the data. So one of the things I jumped in here and brought in was just the benchmarking. So these are the industry averages that pop up. So while on the surface, it may look like 2015, you know, either was a good target year or a bad target year, the industry average for 2015 is 16.7%. So I am performing better than the average. You can see in most years, 2016, I'm running about 14%, and the industry average is 17.8%. And then in 2017, you know, something happened. I jumped over 10% to 28, almost 29% turnover for the year. Putting it in perspective of the industry is at 18.5%, so about 10% over the industry. And while I may want to flag this to understand what exactly led to this, I also see in my events that mid-2016, we did a corporate acquisition. And most of the time, when you go through acquisition, you're not just acquiring the technology and the clients, but you're also acquiring the staff. And so usually what happens after acquisitions is we do see a spike in turnover as the staff, you know, finds their way, whether they were comfortable with the old environment, they're not comfortable in the new environment. As I've been on both sides of mergers and acquisitions in my past, it's always better to be the acquiring company than the acquired company from the perspective of the employee culture. When you're acquired, you're usually required to adapt to the new corporate culture, which may or may not be to your liking. So that helps to really put in place this spike in turnover for 2017. Might not be as bad as it looks. And in fact, when we move forward to 2018, things begin to correct themselves and our turnover comes right back in line. Now, again, we look at 2018 and we say, okay, but it's still higher than it was in 2016. We're currently trending 16.5%, or we did trend 16.5% for 2018. When we weigh that on an industry benchmark, we see the industry benchmark year over year for the last 5 years has increased every year. We don't actually see this slowing down. We see this continuing. So the industry is turning over at 19.3%. So this comes back in line to, I'm actually doing all right. I'm not quite 3% under industry average, which comes back and is excelling where I've been in the past to between 2 and 3% below industry average. And so now in 2019, I can see that my turnover already is on track to be a little bit higher. But given that we're expecting industry turnover to exceed 20% on average in 2019 for the first year, you know, I'm right back in line to within 2 to 3% under industry average. So at a very high level, this is saying that, you know, all things really aren't that bad. They're kind of in line with what we're seeing. So now let's quickly come back to look at my 1 year, and we're going to go into the predictive model to see how this is trending going forward. So what we have is the last 6 months of actuals in the system being straight line reported, and then going forward in line with the annual prediction, what does that turnover look like month over month? So we can see in June, with the onset of summer, we expect another little bit of an increase, taking us to just under 6%. And then things leveling off and coming back down as the summer progresses. So it looks fairly flat, but you can see it is correcting and coming back in line, but not very quickly. So I want to look at, you know, how I can actually have positive impact on this. And so when we go in, we can look at our summary, which gives us our predicted metrics month over month. And I want to jump into modeling. So I want to see how decisions the organization can make are predicted to impact the organization. So first and foremost, the standard reaction is, well, we're just going to have to pay people a little bit more. Let's give them a spot bonus and see if we can keep them from leaving the organization. So I can go in and model what happens if I give everybody a $5,000 across the board increase. And we can see that it's had the most impact on June. We stopped a few people from leaving, but you'd really like to think that $5,000 a year would have a greater impact than that. And we'll come back to this. But the system is telling us that no, the salary is not actually one of the key drivers of the turnover. And if you factor in $5,000 per employee, it might be a 1,000 employee organization. That was just a $5 million investment we made. And the downfall when you think about reporting and metrics return on your investment is that it really didn't help us that much. Where else? We all have budgets. We all need to work within these budgets. So where else can we apply this money that might get us the results we're looking for in terms of retaining our talent? So if we go down to the next metric, we can see that we've got a fairly reasonable employee work from home policy. I'm going to shrink my resolution so we can get a little bit more up on the screen here. And we've got about a third of our workforce taking advantage of that. Now, in my organization, not all organizations can have hefty work from home policies, but let's say I've got a lot of data analysts. And there's not a reason that they need to be in the office all day, every day. Someday I just need them to be heads down working on their projects. So what would it look like if I were to come in and bump this up 10% to 45% engagement, almost half, be even more liberal with it? Now, when I go back to the predictive indicators, this is actually having more of an impact, something in line with what we'd expect. So we almost immediately stop the increase of turnover. Employees are liking this. And we reverse course within 6 months to bring us back into better levels of a 4% turnover rate. But it's also important to understand specifics within the population of how this is having an impact. So when I break it down by performance, one of the industry interesting insights here is that I'm having the biggest impact on my non-performing population. So I'm driving them down the fastest, and I'm actually leaving my high performers at a relatively high rate. And so this is the importance of being able to drill into these metrics and see quickly, am I driving the change? So we first saw, yes, I was driving change, but now when I go into driving meaningful change and what's best for the business, I actually have to bring the assumption back into question that I'm driving down the wrong population, which is a problem. We want to keep these high performers. They're good for the business. So now I look at our professional development program. And while we've had one and we've advertised it, it's still sitting at only just over 6% utilization, which is pretty low for professional development. If there's something we know about high performers, we know they like to be in development programs. We know they like to give back to the organization and be groomed. So what happens if I make a concerted effort to go ahead and double my professional development efforts? So I take it from 6% of the population to 12% of the population. And now when we look at our indicators, we're seeing the most drastic and meaningful impact of our population. So we've still driven down overall turnover, far greater than it was before. We're now, by the end of the year, at 1.5%, which is a much better number for us. More importantly, we're driving down that high performer turnover, less than 1% by November. And we haven't done this through salary. If we go back to our model, we've done this through work from home policy and professional development, which between the two of them is probably less of an investment than the $5 million we were looking at with just the salary bump. So now the power of natural language processing, we want to say, why not give bigger raises? Why did that not have the impact on our population that you would think it would? And when we bring up this benchmarking data, well, it's important to understand how you're operating internally as well as externally. This is how it is today. This isn't on the predictive side. And what we see in all cases, we are either at or above industry averages for compensation. So for whatever reason our staff is leaving the business, they're not leaving the business based on pay alone. They might even be taking a pay cut to go down the street. So it's obviously an additional opportunity, whether it be professional development, work-life balance, something else that is driving their behavior. And that's why it's so important to have this benchmarking data to make impactful decisions in your company. Going back to the predictors, once we have that prediction on our model, establishing those benchmarks, we knew that we were expecting turnover to drop around 1% rate by the end of the year based upon our assumptions. So it's key then to go back and establish those measurement metrics to say, by implementing these programs and doing it right away, by the end of June, how are we tracking to a 3.6% turnover target? So we're not stopping turnover. So the first time somebody quits, we don't have a knee-jerk reaction and say, oh no, these measures aren't working. We actually put it in context to understand this is driving change over time, which will have an ultimate impact. But we need to have these stop checks in terms of am I on target? And if I'm not on target, let's say my turnover is trending high, maybe I implemented the program at the end of June, so I wouldn't expect it to immediately impact June, to then look at July and say, are we seeing a reversal? If not, we may have to go back and question some of our assumptions. Maybe there's some survey data here that we didn't account for, specifically why it's leading into turnover. Another area for benchmark and insight for analytical data is sources of hire. So as we're turning people over, we're also bringing people into the company. We want to look at similar things. Where are we going to find the most candidates and the best candidates? So in bringing up our sourcing information, we can look at this over the past 3 years, and we can see a clear leader here of job boards. So we're bringing candidates from a variety of places. Employee referrals is a good source. We also have job fairs that are a good source. We've got LinkedIn and Facebook down here. But initial cut of the data is going to tell me job boards are a good place to look for candidates. Now that's at that high level view, and it's just looking total population. What happens when I want to look at this information by performance? So now I've taken that same aspect, I've brought it down, and I can see where are my top performers coming from. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to take my performance data and I'm going to filter out my 2s and my 3s and my blanks. I'm going to look at just 4s and 5s. I'm going to put this back in and give me my 3-year view. And now, if you notice, the tables have changed. So no longer is job boards being my far and away leading supplier of candidates. But now LinkedIn has quickly risen to the top. And in some cases, employee referrals, when I look back for 2017, are actually exceeding general job boards. So this is another key area to keep in mind, that when you're going and investing on sourcing talent, it's not just general talent. All data being blind, you can say a body is a body. But when you can really dive in to say, where are my best employees coming from in terms of culture fit, in terms of productivity, I can now see that LinkedIn is actually one of the better places for us to invest our time and energy. So by slicing the data from that perspective, I've now changed my investment strategy from putting more into job boards to now putting more in LinkedIn. Based on the data we see here, we're going to expect the LinkedIn to actually return better quality of candidates for the organization. So we're coming up at the end of our time. We have just a few minutes left here. So coming back to the dashboard and coming back to our question and answer pane. Give me just a second. Are there any questions from the attendees today in terms of benchmarking, general questions, data analysis, how to engage, or how TrenData can help?
Yeah, Andrew, there were a few questions that came in. And I'll start with Michelle P. She simply says, thank you for the valuable info. And I couldn't agree more. It really is benchmarking these people metrics, takes this already available data and gains this context and really transforms facts into informative and comprehensive stories that catalyze change. So here's a question from Rachel, Andrew. Rachel asks, can we compare our number of applications per job position and time to fill, then benchmark against those industry standard figures?
Yes, you can actually do that. So when you look at, we don't have a ton of time here, so it won't take long. So we can always set up, before I switch off, we've got info at TrenData. If you'd like, we can set up a personal one-on-one presentation data analysis, and we can dive into your specific data for questions like these. We look at time to fill, and so we see a simple bullet up on the dashboard, 37.5 days. We can quickly jump in and drill into this data, and we can see across our business units how our average time to fill are doing, as well as we can compare this with industry benchmarks. Typically, what we're seeing today is about 90 days on average to fill these positions. So you can see overall, we're doing fairly well, about half the average, and mortgage seems to be leading the way with 27.5 days average to fill.
Okay, thanks. So Miranda has a question for us too. She asks, will your NLP search work with the benchmarking data that's imported, or just the data pulled from our traditional HR systems, such as the HRIS, applicant tracking system, like ADP, she says?
Yes, it'll actually work across all your data. So you look in to the example of why not give bigger raises, and it is looking at your internal data, comparing it against your external data. You can also look at things like show me the top reasons employees are leaving the organization, to where it'll go and pull your survey data and organize that, look at your terminations, and show you who's leaving, why are they leaving. You can drill in. You can also slice and dice that information by performance as well. So you can say, why are my high performers leaving versus my non-high performers? So it's very powerful in that regard of not only showing you your data, drilling into your data, but then always keeping it in the context of how is the general industry doing, so you know how you're comparing to those benchmarks.
Right. That's good. So final question here, Andrew, from, and I hope I'm getting this name right, Firas asks, can you work with various benchmarking data points from a Mercer subscription we have? It's actually a two-part question here. And he also says, what can TrenData do with those data sets other than visualize it?
Certainly. So yes, back to data sources. We can bring in multiple data sources, even if you're bringing conglomerate, and then tying them back to your specific internal metrics. So this all comes back to the intelligent data gathering. So we always say, just give us all the information you have access to. We will work to sort it out and draw those insights. And then as you come in, you can look at things like number of employees, drill down, point here. Well, it's not specifically tied to the benchmark, but just how you slice and dice. So before you get into the benchmarking, really focusing on a given population. So we can see that we have slightly more males in the organization than females. I can switch and I can bring this up and I say I want to bring them, look at them by division or department. And I can see how our employees are aligned across the organization. So in this data scenario, kind of loosely around banking, we can see that the majority of our employees are in consumer banking. And then to the benchmark point, how do we benchmark consumer banking, which may be different from commercial banking? So from that Mercer scenario, you'd be able to look and dive into these populations separately. So you can go in for a specific and you say, okay, here are my departments. I want to turn off all of them, but I want to come back to this consumer banking. And I just want to focus on that for my insight. And now I can look at this given population and start to benchmark this against those industry averages. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour, so I wanted to thank you guys for joining our webinar today, Strengthening Your Workforce by Using Benchmarks and Industry Analytics Data. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I am Andrew Davis. Thank you for your time. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact us at info@trendata.com. Have a great day.